The bell at Marchwood had not been rung for a death in 19 years, and the man on the rope did not know how to make it sound like grief. It came down the valley in ugly, uneven strokes, and the crows went up off the beech trees in a black sheet. On the coast road below the park wall, a woman stopped and listened. She had been 3 days walking. Her feet were bound in sailcloth gone the color of mud, and she wore a fisherman's oilskin that smelled of herring. "They have started," she said. Behind her, an older woman set down a bundle. "Then we are not too late. We are not too early either." The gates of Marchwood stood open, which they did 4 times a year and never otherwise. Black plumes nodding on the horses. Footmen in Marchwood gray with mourning bands sewn on in a hurry, because the thread did not match. At the gate stood old Tobias, who had kept it for 40 years. "Move along, mother," he said, not unkindly. "There is nothing here today. I want to go into the chapel." So does half the county, and half the county was invited. He looked at her properly, and something crossed his face that was not recognition but was near it. "You are off the coast. Then you know it is a duchess they are burying, and you know what you look like." She did not move. 2 tenants' wives came past in good wool. 9 days, one said, behind her hand, nailed down at Marsh End and never opened after. Not for the family, not for anyone. The water does things to a body. It does. But you would think a husband would want to look. The older woman took hold of her wrist hard, the way you take hold of somebody standing too near an edge. "Not out here," she said low. "They will say you are mad and they will be believed. That is the whole of the trick, and it has worked before. I know what it has done before." Then wait for the church. In a church there are witnesses they cannot buy. The hearse came down the drive at a walk. Oak, brass at the corners, and on the lid a brass plate polished so hard that it threw the gray daylight into the crowd like a small cold sun. The mourners took off their hats in a ripple, the way corn goes down in wind. The woman in the oilskin read the plate, and read it again, slowly, the way you reread a line in a letter that has not yet finished being cruel to you. She knew that name. She had written it at the foot of 40 household accounts, and once, in a shaking hand, on a marriage register, in that same chapel. It was her own. If stories like this one find you tonight, take a moment and subscribe before we go on. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from. And tell me this too. Would you have walked into that church or turned back? Stories like these travel further than you would believe. Now let us begin. Because to understand what she did in that chapel, you must first know how she came to be standing outside it in another woman's coat. Her name was Adelaide Hale before it was anything grander, and her father was a country physician at Wexbridge, who was paid in geese as often as in coin. She met Alistair Vane, Duke of Marchwood, in her father's surgery after a horse went down with him and rolled. She set the bone. He swore at her. She told him that if he intended to swear, he might do it in a language she did not understand, so that she could go on liking him. They married in the spring. There is a way that a great house receives a woman like that, and it involves no raised voices. Nobody at Marchwood was ever rude to Adelaide. That was the thing she could never make her father understand. Nobody was rude. They were exquisite. "Your Grace will forgive me," said Lady Cordelia Vane on the first evening, drawing out a chair for her and then very gently drawing it back again. "Not that one. That is the chair the Duchess sits in." "I am the Duchess." "Of course you are." Cordelia smiled with great warmth. "I mean the chair the Duchess sits in when the county is watching. It has a draught. My aunt sat in it 30 years, and it gave her a stiffness she carried to her grave, and she never once complained, because it was hers. Nobody expects you to begin there." Cordelia was his cousin. She had lived at Marchwood since she was 11, had run it for 9 years, and had expected with the whole of her patient and orderly heart to be Duchess of Marchwood herself. She never said so. She said other things. "I can read a ledger," Adelaide said once, when the household books were mentioned. "I am sure you can read your father's ledger." The servants took their tone from her, because Cordelia wrote their characters when they left. Adelaide rang, and nobody came. When she mentioned it, somebody was dismissed for it, and after that, nobody came at all, only faster. Her letters left the house and were never answered, and when she asked for the Wexbridge physician to be sent to a tenant's child, the steward, Mr. Silas Crook, stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and said, in a soft voice, that a house speaks with one voice, or it does not speak at all. And Alistair was not there. The assizes, the session in London, Newmarket, a christening in Kent, they are difficult with me, she told him once. Cordelia is difficult with everyone. She was difficult with my mother. Give it time. He kissed her forehead. He was a handsome, easy, well-liked man who had never in his life had to be brave about anything, and it had not yet occurred to either of them that this was a defect and not a temperament. She gave it time, and in the autumn of the 3rd year she found that she was carrying his child, and by the time she was certain of it he had gone to London, and Cordelia knew. The scullery maid at Marchwood was called Nell Rudd. She was 14, and in November she broke a dish. It went out of her wet hands onto the flags and made a great deal of noise, and Adelaide, on the back stairs, heard the whole of it from a place where nobody knew she was standing. "Pick it up," said Cordelia. "Yes, my lady. With your hands, Nell, not the brush. I want you to feel how many pieces there are." There was a small sound, then, of a girl kneeling on stone. "Now," Cordelia went on, quite pleasantly, "your mother has the cottage at the end of the row, and your brother has the place in the stable, and your grandmother has her coals off this house in the winter, and none of that is written anywhere, not in any book. It is all only kindness. Do you understand what I am telling you?" "Yes, my lady." "Say it back. It is all only kindness, my lady." "Good girl. Bring me the pieces when you have them all. If there is one missing, I shall know." Adelaide stood on the stairs and understood, in the way you understand a thing you have been looking at for 3 years without seeing, that she was not disliked at Marchwood. She was in the way. She went down and said nothing. She found the last piece under the cooling shelf and put it into Cordelia's palm herself, and Cordelia thanked her with a warmth that would have convinced a bishop. After that, Adelaide listened. And on a wet evening in December, carrying a candle down the west passage because the child had made her wakeful, she heard Cordelia and Silas Crook through the door of the steward's room, which was an inch off the latch. "She will show by Candlemas," Cordelia was saying. "By Easter the county will have seen it. And then it is done, Silas. Then there is a vein of Marchwood with a barber surgeon's blood in him, and no unpicking it. Not ever. His Grace will be pleased. His Grace is always pleased. That is his entire character. Do not look at me like that. I am fond of him. I have been fond of him since he was in short coats, and I have watched him hand this house to a woman who thinks a ledger is a thing you can simply read. There is the question of her health." Out in the passage, Adelaide found that she had put out her candle without deciding to. "Say what you mean," Cordelia said. "She is not strong. The coast is very fine for a weakness of the chest, and Dr. Ansell would write it tomorrow if the house asked him. A season at the coast for her Grace's health, at Marsh End, where the house has property." His voice did not change at all. "It is a great distance for letters. Letters are not the difficulty. No, my lady. His Grace's signature is the difficulty. Without it, it is an abduction. With it, it is a physician's recommendation and a husband's care, and no magistrate in England will look at it twice. He will not sign. He will sign a great many things at once, and read none of them, my lady, if a man he trusts puts them in front of him after dinner and speaks of something else. A small, dry sound, which might have been Crook clearing his throat. He signed for the last one. That is not a thing we say aloud. No, my lady. Not aloud, Silas, not in this house. Out in the dark, with a dead candle in her hand, Adelaide stood absolutely still and thought, the last one. The last what? She could have run. She did not, for a reason she could never afterwards explain, except that she was carrying a child who would one day be told a story about his mother, and she wanted the story to be true. The muniment room was not locked, because nothing at Marchwood was locked. She found it in the wage book for the years to 1806. Alder, J., governess, £24 per annum. The entries ran down the page quarter by quarter and stopped, and against the last one, in a fresher ink, somebody had written the kind of note a clerk writes when he wants a thing to look finished. Removed to Marsh End for her health, at the house's charge. No further sum due. She began to ask very carefully in the way you ask about weather. Was there a governess here before my time? One called Alder. Mrs. Poole's hands stopped in the middle of a fold, for the length of 3 breaths, and then went on. There was. What became of her? She went to the coast, your Grace. For her health. And after the coast? The housekeeper squared the edge of the folded sheet with her palm, and her voice was exactly as flat as before. There was no after, your Grace. That is the whole of what I know, and I would take it kindly if her Grace did not ask me in a passage where the doors are open. That night Adelaide's cordial tasted of nothing, which was strange, because it had always tasted of aniseed. She was a physician's daughter and had ground powders on her father's bench since she was 9. She wet her finger, touched it to her tongue, and stood a long moment in the dark with her heart going hard. Then she poured it into the wash basin and rang, and when Nell came she said she had knocked it over, and would Nell be very good and say nothing, because her ladyship disliked waste. Yes, your Grace, said Nell, and looked at her, and neither of them said anything else, and something passed between them anyway. For 11 days she poured the cordial away, and performed the tiredness she was supposed to feel, and it was the hardest work she had ever done, because a wound does not watch your face. And she waited for Alistair, because Alistair came home at Christmas. You are pale, he said in the hall, in front of everybody, and you have written me 2 letters in 3 months, which is unlike you. Cordelia says you are not strong. She says Ansel has spoken of the coast. There it was, laid on the table between them like a card. Alistair. I must speak to you tonight, not in a passage, and not at dinner. Tonight, with the door shut, of course, after the tenants' supper. But the supper ran late, and then Crook wanted him about the timber, and then Cordelia was at his elbow, saying that dear Adelaide had gone up an hour ago, and had they not agreed she was not to be disturbed. He came up at last, and stood in the doorway for perhaps 4 seconds, and then went away down the passage, quietly, so as not to wake her. In the morning there were guests, and there were guests every day for 11 days, and she never once got him alone. On the 6th of January the last carriage went down the drive, and that night Mrs. Hetty Poole came to Adelaide's sitting-room at 11 o'clock and shut the door behind her with her foot. Your Grace asked me a question at the linen press, and I gave her Grace a coward's answer. I am 63 and too old to be turned off without a character, and I have told myself so for 10 years, and it stopped keeping me warm this Christmas. Sit down, Mrs., Poole, if somebody comes, I would like us to look like two women who are sewing." The housekeeper sat. Adelaide threaded a needle, and her hands were entirely steady, and she was proud of that for the rest of her life. Her name was Jane Alder, Mrs., Poole said, a curate's daughter out of Suffolk, come to teach the young ladies their globes. A plain face and a laugh you could hear across the park, and she was the only person in this house who ever told his Grace the truth to his face. And he was 19, and he loved her the way a boy loves the first person who is not afraid of him. He asked her in the yew walk in the summer of 5, and she said yes the third time of asking, crying, because she was not a fool. They were going to tell the old Duke at Michaelmas. What happened at Michaelmas? Miss Cordelia happened, Your Grace. She was 20, and she had a use for that boy. Mrs. Poole's hands were flat on her knees. There was no shouting. There has never once been shouting in this house. There was a fortnight of the greatest kindness you ever saw. Miss Alder was pale, and Miss Alder was coughing, and had anyone noticed how Miss Alder coughed? And Dr. Ansell wrote what he was asked to write. And then there was a paper. Who signed it? Mrs. Poole looked at the fire. His Grace's father was dying upstairs, and had not known anybody for 11 days. So it wanted the son's hand. Mrs. Crook took it in to him after dinner, with the rent book and the timber accounts, and a matter about a bridge. And his Grace was 19, and half drunk and frightened of his father dying, and he signed 6 papers in a row and talked about a horse the whole time. He did not read it. He did not read it, Your Grace. And I have thought about that for 10 years, and her Grace may think me hard. It is not better. A man who does not read is not innocent. He has only arranged not to know. The fire moved. Somewhere below, a door. She was put in a chaise at 5 in the morning with a box and 11 shillings, and Mr. Crook drove her himself. In April a letter came saying she had died of a putrid fever at Marsh End, and his Grace went out on a horse and did not come back for 2 days, and he never said her name again, not in 10 years. And Miss Cordelia was very good to him that spring, Your Grace. Very, very good to him. Adelaide set down her sewing. Was there a funeral? There was a stone put up at Marsh End at the house's charge, £3 4 shillings, and it is in the book, because Mr. Crook is a careful man, and everything he has ever done is in a book somewhere. Did anyone from Marchwood see her buried? The housekeeper looked up, and her old face was quite gray, and Adelaide understood that this was the sentence she had come up 2 flights of stairs to say. No, Your Grace. Nobody from this house has ever set eyes on that grave. And I have wondered, God forgive me, what it would cost a man like Silas Crook to buy a dead pauper woman off a parish and put a stranger's name on her. Marsh End, Adelaide said. Your Grace must not go near it. Mrs. Poole, they are already sending me there, and out in the passage, distinctly, on the boards that had creaked in that spot since before either of them was born, somebody took a step, and then took great care not to take another. Mrs. Poole was gone before breakfast. Her sister in Norfolk is very low, Cordelia said, buttering toast. She left at 4, in tears, poor creature. Which coach did she take? Mr. Crook drove her to the turnpike himself. He is so good about that sort of thing. Adelaide looked at the length of the table and thought, quite clearly and without any drama at all, I am alone in this house, and I have about a month. She used it. She wrote to her father and did not put the letter in any bag. She gave it to Nell Rudd, and Nell's brother walked it 11 miles to Wexbridge and put it into the doctor's own hand. And one afternoon she came the short way to the gallery over the North Hall, and the library door stood open a hand's width below her. And the bridge at Ockley, Crook was saying, which the county will pay half of. This is only the counterpart, your grace. And this, your grace. What is it? Dr. Ansell's recommendation, and the arrangement for her grace's removal to the coast. Her ladyship has seen it. The house at Marsh End is aired. A woman is engaged. A pause. Adelaide stood at the gallery rail with both hands on the wood and looked down at the top of her husband's head. Until when? Until her grace is well, your grace. Another pause. A very short one, 4 seconds, and she counted them, and afterwards she thought that 4 seconds was exactly the length of a man's whole character. She won't want to go, he said. No, your grace. Then she needn't be asked, I suppose. It's for her health. He picked up the pen. Crook, what did Meredith give for the gray? I heard 800, and I don't believe a word of it. And he signed it, talking about a horse, without turning it round to read the second page. She did not cry out. She was a physician's daughter, and there is a thing you learn at a bedside, which is that the noise you make helps nobody. She went down the back stairs and stood in the cold beside the pump until her face was ordinary again. They came for her on the 21st of February at 5 in the morning, and it was done with the greatest courtesy. A chaise with the blinds already down, a woman inside called Mrs. Barrow with hands like a man's, Crook on the box. Alistair had gone up to London on the 19th. Cordelia kissed her on both cheeks and said, "Write the moment you are settled, and do not think of the household for one instant. I shall manage it all," and she meant every word, and that was the horror of her. The house at Marsh End was 2 rooms at the end of a shingle bank. The salt got into the bread. Mrs. Barrow slept across the door. On the 3rd day, Adelaide asked when Dr. Ansell was expected. "There's no doctor comes here, my duck," said Mrs. Barrow, and went on with her knitting. On the 9th night, the tide was very high. Mrs. Barrow woke her at 2 in the morning, said the water was coming into the lower room, and took her out barefoot across the saltings in the dark, along the shingle spit where the channel runs deep even at the turn. Then she stopped, let go of her arm, and stepped back. "You'll want to keep walking, your grace," she said. "It's shorter that way." And she went back along the spit towards the light in the window, and did not once look round, and the water was already over Adelaide's ankles and rising, and there was no land in any direction, and she was 24 years old and 5 months gone with a child, and there was nobody in the world who knew where she was. If this story has reached you tonight, wherever you are, take a moment and subscribe. It truly does help. And tell me something in the comments. Have you ever had a moment when you understood that the person who was meant to protect you had simply chosen not to look? The tide at Marsh End turns at 3. What saved her was samphire. There is a woman on every salt marsh in England who goes out at the bottom of the tide with a sack and a short knife. And at Marsh End, that woman knew the channel the way you know the stairs in your own house. At 2:30 in the morning, she heard something in the water that was not water. Adelaide came back to herself 3 days later in a room with a turf fire, and the first thing she understood was that her hands were bandaged, and the second was that she was still, unbelievably, carrying her child. The woman gave her name as Anne, and asked no questions at all, which was itself a strange kindness, and on the 4th day Adelaide understood why. "You do not want to know who I am," Adelaide said. "I know what you are." Anne did not look up from the fire. "You're a woman that was walked out on the spit at night by somebody that came back alone. There's a name for that around here, though not one you could say in front of a magistrate. It has happened before." "Yes, to whom?" Anne sat back on her heels, was quiet a long time, and then said, in a completely ordinary voice, "To me." The fire ticked. "My name is Jane Alder. I was a governess at a great house in the west of this county, and I was going to be married to the son of it, and I came out here in April of the year 6 with a box and 11 shillings, and a woman called Barrow took me out on that same spit and used the same words, near enough. I got ashore at the Ness because the wind was off the land. 10 years, and I've never once been 3 miles from it, because I couldn't think where else in England a dead woman is allowed to live." Adelaide sat up. "Miss Alder, there is a stone in the churchyard here with your name on it. I know it. I've stood at it." Jane Alder smiled, and it was not a nice smile, and it was the first entirely honest thing Adelaide had seen on a human face in 3 years. "It's got somebody in it, some poor woman off the parish, no kin, no name, and they gave her mine and £3 4 shillings worth of stone, and every soul in that house has slept sound for 10 years because of her. Can you prove it? I've nothing but my face, and there's not a creature alive that's seen it in 10 years except the fishmonger." "No," Adelaide said. "You have a great deal more than that, because he is a careful man, and everything he has ever done is in a book somewhere." The curate at Marsh End was a very young man named Mr. Bexley, who had not yet learned that some ledgers are not to be looked into. He put the register on the vestry table and turned it back to 1806. "Alder, Jane," he read, "spinster, of this parish. Buried the 12th of April. It is in my predecessor's hand, and I must say his hand was—" He stopped, because the woman in the apron had put both fists on the table and was standing with her head down. "Breathing, sir," said Adelaide. "Would you be good enough to show us the churchwarden's account for that quarter?" He fetched it, and there it was, 4 lines from the bottom, in the flat prose of a man doing his job. "To the overseers, for the removal and coffining of a female pauper, unnamed, deceased at the poorhouse, at the request of Mr. S., Crook, agent, on account of the Marchwood estate, £1 15 shillings. And 2 entries above it on the same page, because a careful man does not vary his method in 10 years, and does not expect anyone to read across a decade of a parish account book. Miss Bexley's own hand had written, 9 days earlier, to the overseers. For a female pauper, unnamed, deceased at the poorhouse, at the request of Mr. S., Crook, agent, £1 15 shillings. Coffin sealed in this vestry, to be conveyed to Marchwood for the burial of her Grace the Duchess." Miss Bexley looked at the 2 entries, then at the 2 women. Then, being young, he sat down rather suddenly on the vestry chair. "The funeral," Adelaide said, "is when? 9 days from that entry, your Grace. Which is to say, it is Thursday. I shall write to the magistrate at once," said Mr. Bexley, reaching for his pen, and Jane Alder put her hand flat on the paper. "Who is he?" "Sir Edmund Rooke, of Ockley Park, a most conscientious gentleman. And where does Sir Edmund Rooke eat his dinner 3 times a month?" The young curate opened his mouth, and shut it, and put the pen down. "At Marchwood." "At Marchwood," Jane agreed. "Sir, I have been dead 10 years on the strength of gentlemen being conscientious with one another. You will forgive me if I would rather not be dead a second time." So they did it the slow way, which is the only way that ever holds. Mr. Bexley made a fair copy of all 4 entries, set out one above the other on a single sheet, so that any man alive could see the same hand, the same agent, the same £1 15 shillings, and wrote an attestation underneath that he had compared it with the originals, and found it true, and that the originals remained in the vestry chest for any person of authority to examine. He signed it, and had it witnessed. Then he took off his stock, put a labourer's coat on over his black, and borrowed his rector's cob without asking. "You will lose your living," Adelaide said. I have been 3 months in a parish where the last curate wrote a woman into the ground for £1 15 and never asked a question about her. He got up on the horse badly. I should like to be a different sort of clergyman than that. Jane Alder had £11 in a stone jar under the hearth, saved out of 10 years of other people's washing, and she took the whole of it and would not discuss it. They went by carrier's cart and on foot over the heath, because the turnpike was watched at Ockley Toll. And on the Tuesday night, Adelaide knocked on her father's door with the flat of her bandaged hand. Dr. Hale opened it in his shirt-sleeves and looked at the beggar woman on his step for a full second before his face came apart. He had 9 letters to give her, his own, sent to the coast and returned unopened, and Ansell's certificate beside them. "Look at the date," he said, and his voice was not steady. He wrote her consumption certificate a fortnight before he laid eyes on her that winter. At Marchwood that same Tuesday, Cordelia Vane sat up until 2 o'clock over the seating for the chapel, put herself at the Duke's left, and thought that a year was not so very long to wait when one had waited 11. The coffin came up from the coast on the Wednesday, and stood in the great hall on trestles with candles at the 4 corners, and when Alastair came down at midnight, and said at last, "Silas, I want it opened," the steward said, very gently, that the sea had had her 9 days, your grace, and that some things are a kindness not to see. And after a moment the Duke said, "Yes, yes, of course," and went back up the stairs. He had not read the second page then either. At 6 on Thursday morning it began to rain, and then it stopped, and the bell started. Mr. Bexley put his stock and his black back on in the lee of the park wall, and clergymen may walk into any church in England by the vestry door, and nobody stops them. He took the 2 women in past a verger who bowed, left them in the shadow under the west gallery where the poor of the parish stood, and went up among the visiting clergy with a folded sheet of paper inside his cassock. The chapel held 400. Dr. Ansell did not look up from his knees. Silas Crook stood at the end of a pew where a steward stands, hands folded, entirely calm, and Lady Cordelia Vane sat at the Duke's left in black silk and wept twice during the psalm, and both times she did it beautifully. At the back, unnoticed, an elderly woman stood with her bonnet strings still tied, because Mrs. Hetty Poole had read a death notice in a Norfolk newspaper on Monday, and had not sat down since. Then the Duke of Marchwood stood up. He was grey in the face, and he had a paper in his hand, and he got as far as the second line of it before he stopped. The silence went on long enough to become a different kind of silence. "I am told," he said, "that a husband is expected to stand here and tell you what she was." He put the paper down on the ledge of the pew. "I find I cannot. Not because grief prevents me. Because I do not know. She was in this house 3 years, and I was in it perhaps 11 months of them. I could tell you what her voice sounded like when she was happy, and I could not tell you one single thing she was afraid of, and a man who cannot tell you that has no business calling himself a husband in a church." Cordelia's hand moved, very slightly, towards his sleeve. He did not see it. In February a paper was put in front of me after dinner, in a stack with a bridge at Ockley and an account for timber. I signed all of them. I signed that one without turning it over, and I asked one question about it, and I want you to hear what the question was, because I have thought about very little else for 9 days. He looked up at the roof beams. The question was not, "What does this mean?" The question was about a horse. Somewhere in the middle of the chapel a woman said, "Oh," out loud, and was hushed. That is the first thing. Here is the second, and then I will sit down. That is the second time in my life I have signed a paper I did not read and stood at a coffin afterwards. The first was 10 years ago. In the November my father was dying, and her name was Jane Alder, and I asked her to marry me in the U-Walk, and I have not said her name aloud under this roof in 10 years. Cordelia's face did not change. It simply stopped. "You will want to be kind to me," the Duke said. "You will want to say I was deceived, and that I am a fool and not a villain. I ask you not to. There was a woman in this house who once said that a man who does not read is not innocent. He has only arranged not to know." His voice went at last. "I have arranged not to know for 10 years, and I have buried 2 women with it, and I would give the whole of Marchwood tonight to any man here who could tell me how to stop being the sort of person that gets other people killed politely." And out of the shadow, under the West Gallery, in the dead flat silence, a woman said, "Say my name again, Your Grace." 400 heads turned. She came up the center aisle in a washerwoman's apron with her raw arms bare to the elbow, and everybody in that church could see she was not a ghost. And that was worse. "Say it again," said Jane Alder. "You've had 10 years' practice at not saying it. Say it to my face." The Duke of Marchwood put out one hand to the pew end and missed it. Jane Alder. Buried in the parish of Marsh End the 12th of April, in the year 6. She turned, unhurried, and looked along the pews at the county, at all of it. There's a stone with my name on it 40 miles from here, and there's a woman under it that nobody has ever named, and she was bought off the parish for £1 15s by that gentleman standing at the end of the pew. Silas Crook did not move at all. That was the thing people remembered afterwards. He did not so much as turn his head, because he had understood, several sentences earlier, exactly how this was going to end. Mr. Bexley stood up among the clergy, unfolded his sheet, and read out the 2 entries 10 years apart, word for word, with the figures and the agent's name. And by the time he reached the last line, the noise in the chapel was such that he had to shout it. And Adelaide Vane walked out of the shadow under the gallery in a fisherman's oilskin, with her feet bound in sailcloth, and stood at the foot of her own coffin. Cordelia Vane rose out of her seat. She was very pale, and she was for one instant magnificent, and she said the thing that hanged her. "You were put out on the spit at the top of the tide." Nobody had said the spit. Nobody had said the tide. Nobody in that chapel had been told anything except that the Duchess of Marchwood had drowned in an accident of the sea. In the third pew, Sir Edmund Rooke stood up very slowly, put his hat down on the seat behind him, and said, in the voice of a man watching his own dinner invitations burn, "Constable, secure the doors." They opened the coffin in the vestry an hour later, and inside it was a woman of perhaps 60, with hands worn down to nothing by a lifetime of work, dressed for the occasion in a shift of good Marchwood linen, which was the only lie anybody had bothered to tell about her. Adelaide would not let them close it again until somebody had found out her name. It took Mr. Bexley 11 days and 4 parishes. She was Sarah Tapp, a widow, a herring gutter at the Ness, who had died in the Marsh End poorhouse with nobody at all beside her. She was buried at Marchwood under her own name, at the Duchess's charge, and Adelaide stood at the graveside in a borrowed black gown, and was the last to leave. The assizes sat in August. Silas Crook was convicted on his own books, and that was the particular justice of it. He was a careful man, and everything he had ever done was in a book somewhere. 14 years of them, recording every shilling of both removals, and £1 15s, twice 10 years apart. He said, when he was asked, that he had never in his life done a thing that had not been wanted of him by somebody above him, and it was the only remark he made that anybody believed. Lady Cordelia Vane pleaded that she had known nothing, and was nearly believed, until the Crown called 11 witnesses to say what she had said out loud in the chapel, before anyone had told her how it was done. She was transported for life, and Adelaide, who had every reason on earth to be glad, found she could not manage glad, and settled for finished. Hetty Poole came back as housekeeper, and Nell Rudd went up to still-room maid, and to housekeeper in the end. Old Tobias, who had turned a beggar woman away from that gate, kept it 6 more years, and told the story to everyone who came through. And it grew a little every time, and nobody minded. Jane Alder would not take money. She took a house and a school, and there are grandmothers in that county now who learned their letters from a plain-faced schoolmistress with raw arms, who told them every September that the 2 most dangerous words in the English language are for her health, and the Duke offered her everything, the estate outright, a separation on any terms she named, Marchwood itself if she wanted it emptied of him. Adelaide refused all of it, and what she said to him she said only once in the library with the door shut. "I am not going anywhere. This house tried to make me nothing, and it did not manage it, and I will not hand it over now out of tidiness." She put the household books down on the desk between them. "But you will read every page, every paper, every dull line of it out loud in this room in front of me before your hand ever touches a pen again. For the rest of your life. That is my price, and there is no other one." He read to her every morning for 22 years, and he was never once late. Their son was born in June, and she called him Thomas Hale Vane, after a country physician who was paid in geese, and the bell at Marchwood was rung for him that summer by the same man who had rung it so badly in the rain. He had had practice by then. It came down the valley slow and even and right. That is the thing about a house, and about a family, and perhaps about a country. It is very rarely brought down by the person who does the cruel thing. It is held up, year after year, by the good, mild, well-liked people who could have asked one question and decided they would rather not know the answer. Silence is not neutral. It has a weight, and it always falls on the same shoulders. If this story stayed with you, subscribe so the next one finds you, and tell me in the comments what you would have said if you had been standing at the back of that chapel. Wherever you are tonight, I hope somebody in your life reads the page before they sign it.